In the last class, we saw how the primary function of language is communication. Was man born with the faculty of speech? Well, scientists, anthropologists, they are of the opinion that the faculty of speech developed during the later stages of human evolution. Hmm? So language evolved over millions of years. But then, whatever we say about language and its evolution, the primary purpose of purpose of using a language is communication. And the chief mode of communication is speech. There is also another mode of communication, which is writing. But of the two, which is more popular or which is more common? It is speech, because speech came first in the history of mankind. When you take the case of an individual, again it was speech that came first. We started writing much later, right? Only after going to school, and the teacher taught us how to hold the pencil and crayon and so on. So, and also there is the advantage that speech is freely accessible to everyone, whereas writing is for the privileged only, or the educated, or the literate lot among us. So, when you take the two modes of communication, speech and writing, speech gathers precedence over writing, or it gains precedence over writing. Speech is also instantaneous, right? There is an immediate feedback and so on. Okay. Now, speech as a mode of communication is made possible only by organs of speech. That is where organs of speech, or our topic, comes into play. Organs of speech. So the moment we speak about organs of speech, we are moving into the anatomy and physiology of speech. And under the anatomy and physiology, we look into the concept of organs of speech. So, what are organs of speech? How do you define organs of speech? Those organs of the human body which are directly or indirectly involved in the production of speech are called organs of speech. And which are these organs? Organs such as lungs and vocal cords and tongue, lips, teeth, even roof of the mouth, the palate and the hard palate, soft palate. All these can be called organs of speech. The next question, of course, is, were they put in the human body for the purpose of speech? The answer is no, because all these organs have other primary functions, which are physiological in nature. For instance, what is the primary physiological function of the lungs? The answer is very simple, easy: respiration. What is the primary physiological function of the teeth? Mastication, chewing. Tongue, maybe eating, tasting, etc. And the vocal cords. Now you know about the vocal cords, which are placed on top of the windpipe. And the gap between the vocal cords is called glottis, and it is through the glottis that air moves in and out of the windpipe. What is the primary physiological function of the vocal cords? Right next to the windpipe, you have the food pipe. So when you eat or drink, there is every chance that food or water could enter the windpipe. So in order to prevent the entry of food and water into the windpipe, the vocal cords come together, or the glottis shuts or closes in order to prevent the entry of food and water into the windpipe. That is the primary physiological function. Because, if the vocal cords are not there, then probably we would choke when we eat or drink. So each of these organs has its own primary or basic function, which is physiological in nature. Now, when we talk about the organs of speech, you must understand that there has been a structural modification. There has been some sort of a functional modification of these organs for speech. So, an organ which was originally constructed for one purpose is converted into an organ for another purpose. So, what was basically meant for respiration has now become an organ of speech. The lungs. Why do you call the lungs as an organ of speech? Because it is not the lungs that do the talking. You know that the sound comes out from the throat, not the lungs. But you must understand that the raw material for speech is air. AIR, air. You cannot speak in vacuum. You cannot speak when there is no flow of air from your lungs. So the raw material of speech is air. And the function of lungs is to supply this air. And you must also understand that it is not static air. On the other hand, a moving current or a moving stream, or in other words, an air stream that moves out of the lungs, that gets converted into speech. All right. So, what is the purpose of the lungs? Supplier of the airstream. So, from this you see that human speech involves anatomy and their adaptation for speech. Now, in this context, I would like to mention one name, Lieberman. He is actually professor of cognitive and linguistic sciences and professor of anthropology at Brown University, USA. Okay, he has written extensively on the evolution of human speech. So, he speaks of human speech as the product of a process that extended over how many years? Nearly 500,000 years. 500,000 years in human evolution. So, speech did not, man did not acquire the faculty of speech overnight. No, it happened over nearly 500,000 years. Okay, so the development of speech apparatus. What do you mean by speech apparatus? All the organs of the body used for speech. This sort of a coordination. The brain sending the message to, remember in the last class we spoke about the brain sending the message to the organs in the mouth and all of them moving accordingly to articulate specific sounds. See, this sort of a coordination we speak of as speech apparatus. And this apparatus, speech apparatus, it evolved or developed over thousands of years. So there was a gradual anatomical adaptation. Of course, this is an adaptation. What is meant for one thing is used for another, or it is modified. The use is modified, and this is what we speak of as adaptation. And Lieberman speaks about this as the adaptation of the speech producing organs. And in this context, probably, for your net and so on, you would find this reference useful. Okay. All right. Now we come to the organs of speech. We can study the organs of speech under three heads: the respiratory system, the phonatory system, and the articulatory system. Respiratory, phonatory, and articulatory system. First, we will do the respiratory system. Which are the organs of speech that can be grouped under the respiratory system? As mentioned on the slide, it comprises the lungs, the muscles of the chest, and the windpipe, basically. You can even include the diaphragm under the respiratory system, because the diaphragm, it expands or contracts, thereby contracting or expanding the lungs. And depending on the contraction and the expansion of the lungs, air is either drawn in or pushed out, right? So you have the entire process. Maybe the diaphragm to a great extent controls the movement of the lungs. So there are certain phoneticians who would include even the diaphragm as an organ of speech and group it under the respiratory system. Right? But basically the lungs, the muscles of the chest, and the windpipe. And look at this diagram. You have a pictorial representation of the human lungs. These are the two lobes, and you see this two small tubes which are called bronchi. The singular is bronchus, plural is bronchi. And the two smaller tubes join to form a larger one, and that larger tube is called the trachea, or it is in layman's term, of course, it is windpipe. The windpipe or trachea. We know that the the air that leaves the lungs or comes into during inhalation, air is drawn into the lungs. During exhalation, air is pushed out of the lungs. Either way, the air travels through the trachea and the bronchi into the lungs, and through the bronchi and the trachea out of the lungs. All right. So, and again, all right, this is the function of the respiratory system. What is the role of the respiratory system in relation to the production of speech sounds? I already answered this question. The respiratory system initiates the movement of air, or the flow of air, or the moving current of air, or air stream from the lungs. And this air stream is the raw material for speech, for the production of speech sound. It is this air that gets converted into sound. Alright? That's all for articulatory system. The phonatory system comprises the larynx and the vocal cords. The larynx and the vocal cords. In the last class we did respiratory system. So today, phonatory system. The larynx is a very important organ of speech because it is in the larynx that the sound is produced. The air that comes out of the lungs, the airstream that leaves the lungs, gets converted into sound in the larynx. So, the larynx is known as the sound producing apparatus of the human body, or it is the sound box or the voice box of the human body. So, what is this larynx? Larynx is nothing but a casing, What do you mean by a casing? A box or a container of something is called as a casing. This, the larynx is a casing made of muscles and cartilages and so on, alright? And the moment we use the term casing, we know that it accommodates something, right? It's a box that contains something. So, larynx is a casing that accommodates or houses a very vital organ of speech, the vocal cords. What are these vocal cords? The vocal cords are two lip-like flaps of muscle. Again, vocal cords are made of muscle. They are placed horizontally, attached at one end and detached at the other. Two lip-like structures placed horizontally in the larynx, that is the throat, attached at one end and free at the other. The space between the vocal cords is called the glottis because, they are free at one end, they can be moved, and when they are pulled apart, there is a space that opens, and that space is called the glottis, or it is a hole or an opening, nothing more than an opening. As I said, the vocal cords are placed on top of the windpipe, and when they are drawn together, this opening vanishes, and the passage to the windpipe is closed or shut, meaning the vocal cords have to be pulled apart and the glottis open for air to either leave the lungs or enter the windpipe. Okay, so that is the glottis is the passage for the air to leave and enter the lungs. So the vocal cords, again I read what is there on the slide. They are two lip-like flaps of muscle placed horizontally, attached at one end and detached at the other. The space between the vocal cords is called the glottis. But you should not imagine the free end floating freely in the larynx, okay? Actually, they are attached to other mobile muscles. So, those mobile muscles move in order to draw the vocal cords apart or to pull them together and so on. And this movement of the vocal cords, I must tell you, it's an involuntary action. We are not conscious of the movement, right? I think at the most we can only identify the vibration of the vocal cords. Okay, now when do the vocal cords vibrate? Let us see. During speech, or not exactly during speech, there are three positions possible for the vocal cords. One, the vocal cords are held wide apart. The glottis is wide open. Two, the vocal cords are held loosely together and glottis is very narrow. Third, vocal cords are held tightly together. Glottis is completely shut, and in this position, no sound can be produced. When do the vocal cords assume this position? Only during eating and drinking, to prevent the entry of food and water into the lungs. But for speech, the vocal cords must be either held loosely together, or they must be held wide apart, meaning the glottis must be wide open or at least narrowly open. Otherwise, sound cannot be produced, because what is the raw material for sound? It is air that comes out of the lungs. So, in order to gain access or to give, the freedom for the air to move, the glottis has to be open, because that is the passage through which air enters and leaves the lungs. Okay, so when the vocal cords are loosely held together, I have demonstrated this in a video a little later. Okay, we will come to that very soon, but for the time being, I'll explain that. Vocal cords can be held loosely together. Place your index finger and your middle finger parallel to each other and bring them loosely together. Now, do you see this gap between the two fingers? That probably can represent the narrow glottis. Now, if air pushes its way from below through this narrow glottis, don't you think the vocal cords will vibrate? Yes. This can easily be demonstrated by using two pieces of paper. You keep the two pieces of paper apart so that there is a huge gap between them, and you blow air between the two pieces of paper. Nothing will happen to the paper if you're holding them wide apart. Right? The air will just leave your body. That's all. Will just move on. But then, when you bring the two pieces of paper close together with a very narrow gap between them, and now when you blow through the narrow gap, what will happen to the paper? The paper will flutter. The pieces of paper will flutter. Right? That is exactly what happens when the glottis is narrow. Air pushes its way through the narrow glottis, and because of the pressure of the air pushing, the vocal cords vibrate. This vibration of the vocal cords can be felt by you. All you have to do is place your hand on your throat and pronounce the sound for the letter S and Z. Try it. And Z. There is no vibration of the vocal cords when you pronounce S, sir. But when you pronounce Z, Z, definitely there is the vibration of the vocal cords. Right? In English, there are only 9 voiceless sounds in English. All the other 35 sounds are voiced. English has a total of 44 sounds, 24 consonants and 20 vowels. See, I have listed out the voiceless sounds in English. What do you see? Do you find any vowel sound here? T, k, f, th, s, sh, k, ch. But no vowel sound, which means all the 20 vowel sounds in English are voiced sounds. You understand? So, what is a voiced sound? A sound that is produced I think there is a small mistake here. I will have to correct it. Held wide apart, glottis is wide open. Using glottis narrow, not wide open. Glottis is narrow, and what kind of sound is produced? A voiced sound is produced, and this voiced sound is otherwise not called breath. It is just referred to as voice. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Now we do this again. So what are voiced sounds. Voiced sounds are those that are produced when the vocal cords are held loosely together and the glottis is narrow. And voiced sounds are accompanied by vibration of the vocal cords. So voiced sounds are called voiced sounds or merely as voice. Let's look at voiceless sounds. What is the position of the vocal cords? They are held wide apart, so the glottis is wide open, and such sounds are called voiceless. And there is another term for voiceless sound. What is it? It is called breath. So, in case in the examination you are asked for 1 mark to define breath, don't speak of it as the air that we use for breathing. No, you have to give the definition of the voiceless sound. Also, if they ask you for a definition for voice, don't say it is a sound that is produced. Give the definition for the voiced sound. So voiceless sound is called breath and voiced sound voice. And how many voiceless sounds do we have in English? Only 9. So 15 consonant sounds and 20 vowel sounds are voiced. Only 9 voiceless sounds. So here is a pictorial representation of the larynx. See, this is the trachea. The larynx is placed on top of the trachea or the windpipe. Larynx, I told you, is a sort of a casing. Casing made of what? Casing made of muscles and tissues and cartilage, and it accommodates the 2 vocal cords. Can you see the 2 vocal cords there in yellow? Yes. And the narrow gap between the vocal cords, that is sometimes when the vocal cords are held wide apart, this narrow gap of course would be wide. It would become wide. The glottis would be wide open, and that is the position in which we breathe. And certain sounds, the voiceless sounds, are produced in this position of the vocal cords, not the one shown here, because the one shown here has a very narrow glottis. The vocal cords are held loosely together. You see that? Yes. So, this is a pictorial representation of the larynx. Then I thought I would explain this, what a glottal stop is. When you produce a vowel sound, any sound, especially a vowel sound, there is an audible release, meaning there is a slight explosive noise after the complete closure of the glottis. Okay, this may not be very clear. For a definition, this is fine, but I will explain it even in the video. For now, this is the explanation that I would like to give. That is, when you when you produce, not that you can't produce a sound in surprise. You can only utter words in surprise, right? So, when you speak in surprise or in shock, or when you exclaim something, there is a lot of emotion also attached to an exclamation, or when you say something in shock or surprise, right? So, the first word that you utter in shock could come out almost like a scream. Not exactly a scream, but then, what happens is the vocal cords come tightly together and suddenly are pulled apart in order to produce a sound during exclamation or when something is uttered in shock or surprise. Okay? And when the vocal cords are held, pulled apart suddenly from that tightly held position or from the closure of the glottis, the glottis is opened quickly, especially when you utter something as an exclamation. The first sound would be accompanied by a slight explosive noise. And this noise is called glottal stop. Please girls, you must understand that the glottal stop is not a phoneme in English. It is not a phoneme. But in certain world languages, it is a phoneme. So that explosive noise, is actually a phoneme, which means many words use it, and people who grow up hearing the language spoken with these explosive noises produced at the glottis, of course they can easily produce it, whereas we find it difficult to consciously produce it. But for demonstration's sake, I have done it in the video. I'll repeat it here. For example, when you say a word like oh, really, O, O, and so on, I pronounced it without the explosive noise. But if it is a real exclamation, then probably you would pronounce it as oh, 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 oh. Now, was there a difference between O and O with a slight explosive noise? I can hear it. I'm not sure whether it, um, transfers to the mic, whether the mic is able to catch it. The microphone of my laptop, whether it's able to catch it, I'm not very sure. But normally when I demonstrate this in the classroom, before my students, they're able to catch the explosive noise immediately. That happens only when something is uttered as an exclamation or, as a result of a shock. You respond to a shocking news or something in this manner. There is a slight explosive noise that accompanies the first sound of the first word that you utter. Okay? And this noise is called glottal stop. So what happens? The vocal cords are held together. There is closure of the glottis, and from that position, the glottis is, the vocal cords are pulled apart to open the glottis for speech. We are not conscious of all this happening. We never knew that during an exclamation, a sudden exclamation, this happens to the vocal cords. We never knew that they would come together and then pull apart so that, the explosive noise is heard. You hear the glottal stop when native speakers speak English. Alright? So the glottal stop is not a phoneme in English, but it definitely can be heard in the speech of native speakers. Now we'll take a look at the articulatory system. It comprises the pharynx, the roof of the mouth, the tongue, and the lips. You know that the air that comes out of the trachea or the lungs, it reaches the larynx, and in the larynx it is modified into sound, and the sound that comes out of the larynx into the articulatory system, it gets modified into specific speech sounds before it is released into the atmosphere. So it is the articulatory system that modifies the sound into specific speech sounds. So all the organs under the articulatory system are called articulators. There can be two types of articulators, active and passive. What is an active articulator? One that is mobile or flexible, that can be moved, is called an active articulator. For instance, the tongue. You know that the tongue keeps moving all the time when you speak. So it's very active. Whereas you have certain other organs like the teeth involved in speech, especially when you say th, or when you say f, the teeth come into contact with the lower lip and so on. So in such cases, in the case of organs like the teeth, the heart, palate and so on, they remain passive or immobile during speech, and these articulators are called passive articulators. So we will take up the first one, pharynx. What is the pharynx? The space above the larynx and below the back of the tongue is called the pharynx, or that space. It is just a cavity. It is just a cavity. The mouth cavity is called the oral cavity. So the air that leaves the larynx enters the pharyngeal cavity or the pharynx, and then it moves into the mouth or the oral cavity or through the nose. If it is respiration, it would go through the nose, that is the nasal cavity, and reach the atmosphere. So the pharynx does not have a direct role in the production of or in the articulation of speech. It does not exactly, modify the sound into a particular speech sound. On the other hand, what is the role of pharynx in the production of speech? The principal function or the main function is that it acts as a resonator of the sound. Sometimes we speak about people with very rich voices, or we say that they have a resonating voice, a vibrant voice, and we speak of such voices as rich voices. It is the pharynx, or it is the size of the pharynx, that determines that reverberating quality or that vibrant quality of the sound. Okay. Now the pharynx can be divided into two areas as oropharynx and nasopharynx. What is oropharynx? The part of the pharynx which is closer to the mouth cavity is called oropharynx, and the part of the pharynx which is closer to the nasal cavity is called the nasopharynx. The size and the shape of the pharynx can vary from individual to individual. Even the size and shape of the oropharynx and nasopharynx could be different in different people. Alright? So, this is the role of the pharynx in the production of speech. Then we come to, I'll start from the outside. Lips. The two lips also play an important part in the production of certain sounds, both consonants and vowels. For example, you can't pronounce the sound O, O, U without the help of the lips, because the lips have to assume a rounded shape in order to produce a sound like oo. When you say v, f, and so on, again the lower lip comes into contact with the upper row of teeth. Try it out. F, v, yes. Right? So they do play an important part in the production of certain sounds. And usually the consonant sounds that are produced with the help of the lips are called labials. For example, b. The two lips come together. M. Again, the two lips, they're called bilabials. But when you have a sound like f, the lower lip and upper teeth, and so you call them labiodental and so on. In the production of vowel sounds, the lips assume various shapes. For example, oo, rounded. But when you say e, it is slightly spread. Or when you say a or a, it is neutral. It is neither rounded nor spread. So, it's possible that way. And then, when you speak about rounded sounds, sounds like o, oo, and so on, there can be two types of rounding. When you say oo, there is close rounding. Look at the opening, it's very small. And when you say o, open rounding, because the lips open up and allow larger volume of air to pass through. Okay, open rounding and close rounding. Then we will move on to the roof of the mouth. What are the organs in the roof of the mouth? You have the teeth ridge, the hard palate, soft palate, and the uvula. Teeth, of course, is a passive articulator. And as I explained, it is touched by the tongue for certain sounds like the, or f, v. In the case of f, v, the tongue is not involved. It is the lower lip and the teeth that come together. So, then the second, of course, is the teeth ridge. The teeth ridge is an important organ as far as English sounds are concerned, because many of the, at least 6 of the consonants are articulated as alveolar sounds. Remember, the teeth ridge is also known as alveolar ridge or alveolum, simply as the alveolum. And any sound that is produced with the involvement of the alveolar ridge or teeth ridge is called an alveolar sound. So what is this teeth ridge? Do something. Run your tongue just behind your upper row of teeth. You feel the teeth now? Take your tongue further up. You feel the gums? How does it feel? Does it feel smooth? Or do you get that serrated feeling? Yes. That is the alveolar ridge. The serrated ridge of the gums is called the alveolar ridge. Pronounce the sound n in nice. N. Don't you feel the tongue touching the alveolar ridge? Yes. D. Yes. D. Yes. Okay. So, the teeth ridge is involved in the production of sounds, speech sounds. It is also a passive articulator. It doesn't move. Then, just beyond the teeth ridge, you have an area which is called the post-alveolar region. That is just before the roof of the mouth starts caving in. Just before that, you have a small area beyond the gums, which is called the post-alveolar region. And we have one English sound produced with the tongue touching this area, which is the post-alveolar sound R. Now, hard palate. It's a passive articulator again. What is the hard palate? It is the bony concave area beyond the post-alveolar region. Right? Run your tongue over that area. How does it feel? It might be smooth, but is it soft? Definitely not. It is very hard. Right? And what is the structure? It caves in. So it is concave, not convex. It is concave. So this bony concave part of the roof of the mouth is called the hard palate. And sounds produced with the tongue touching the hard palate or coming close to the hard palate, they are called palatals. And we have one English sound. I will go into the details of English sounds and the articulators involved in the production of each English sound later. Okay, this is just introductory. This part is only introductory. So I will not take up the details now. Just remember that at least one sound is produced as a palatal sound in English. Next organ in the roof of the mouth is the soft palate. Come on, try it. Run your tongue beyond the hard palate. Suddenly it becomes very soft, right? That is called the soft palate. The soft palate is otherwise known as velum. It's a soft, fleshy, muscular portion, right? Not behind soft palate, behind hard palate or beyond hard palate. It is a soft, fleshy, muscular portion beyond hard palate. I would say not behind, beyond hard palate. Okay. In the next slide, I've taken up the soft palate for a detailed discussion. So for now, I will skip that and come to the last extreme end of the roof of the mouth, which is a fleshy conical structure hanging over the cavity or the mouth or the pharynx. Okay, at the extreme end of the roof of the mouth. You know, when children cry, you can see this part very clearly. It vibrates. Have you noticed that? That structure is called the uvula. You can open your mouth and look into the mirror and you can see that small conical structure hanging over the mouth, and that is the uvula. The uvula is not directly involved in the production of any speech sound in English. But in certain world languages, you have speech sounds or phonemes produced with the involvement of the uvula. Okay, and since I don't know any language which uses uvula for the production of speech sound, I can't demonstrate it for you, but just accept it on faith. Then I told you I will explain the soft palate once again. So, which is the location of the soft palate? It is beyond the hard palate. It is called the soft palate because it is soft to touch. It is also known as the velum, right? Now, this acts like a valve opening and closing something. I told you the air that comes out of the larynx enters the pharynx. The air from the pharynx can reach the atmosphere through two passages. One is the mouth passage and the other is the nose passage. One is the oral cavity and the other is the nasal cavity. Oral tract or nasal tract. Oral passage or nasal passage. See, you have two avenues for the air to escape into the atmosphere. So, not every sound is produced with air escaping through the mouth. When you pronounce a sound like you know that the two lips come together and block the passage of air through the mouth or the oral passage. So, air is forced to move up and through the nose, right? It reaches the atmosphere through the nose. So, what exactly controls the movement of the air through the mouth or the nose? It is the soft palate. Alright, it is the soft palate. Now, we are not very conscious of the movement of the soft palate, but I can make you aware of the movement of the soft palate by asking you to swallow. Just imitate swallowing and then breathe immediately. Try and swallow first. Okay, swallow your saliva. Okay, swallow and then breathe. Immediately breathe. At that point, you can feel the soft palate, disengaging itself or disconnecting with some part of your body. You can feel that disengagement. Can you try it out once again? Swallow, breathe, and exactly when you start breathing, there is a small movement up there, somewhere in your roof of the mouth, right? That is because when you swallowed, the soft palate came into contact with the back wall of the pharynx and shut the nasal passage, alright? So that the oral cavity was open. Shut the nasal passage. It is in that position that oral sounds are produced. What is an oral sound? A sound that is produced with air escaping only through the mouth, only through the oral tract. So, the soft palate gets raised to touch the back wall of the pharynx during the production of an oral sound. That is why after swallowing, when you just removed it, when you started breathing, you felt that disconnection, That was the soft palate lowering itself. Because when you breathe, the soft palate has to be lowered so that what is open? The nasal passage is open. So what do you understand from that? When you lower the soft palate, the nasal passage becomes open. Okay? Nasal passage becomes open. So, you need to lower the soft palate in order to produce a sound like We have 3 nasal sounds in English. Ma, na, nga. Right? 3 nasal sounds in English. And air escapes only through the nose for these 3 nasal sounds, which means the soft palate is lowered and there is some block in the oral tract so that air is forced to leave through the nasal passage. Got it? So this is exactly the role of the soft palate. But if you want to produce an oral sound, what will happen? The soft palate raises itself to touch the back wall of the pharynx so that nasal passage is completely closed. This closing of the nasal passage by raising the soft palate is called velic closure. And velic closure is essential for what kind of sounds? For sounds produced through the mouth, or in other words, for oral sounds. Got it? There are only 3 nasal sounds. So how many oral sounds in English? 41 oral sounds. Do you understand, girls? Do you want me to repeat it? I'll try and repeat in very simple terms quickly. The soft palate acts like a valve, opening and closing the nasal passage. When you breathe, the soft palate is lowered so that the nasal passage is open and air keeps moving in and out of the nasal passage into the lungs and so on. You know the route by now, right? Nasal passage to pharynx through the glottis into the trachea, bronchi and the lungs. And when you exhale from the lungs through the bronchi to the trachea, through the glottis into the pharynx, and from the pharynx it can go through the nose. But when you have a very bad cold and when your nose is completely blocked, what do we do? How do we breathe? Sometimes through the mouth, right? That is also possible. But when we speak, the nose, the passage through the nose or the passage through the mouth is open, not both together. Either the oral tract or the nasal tract is available for the air to escape into the atmosphere during speech. Alright? So, what do you need? You need the soft palate to close the nasal passage when you produce oral sounds. And most of the sounds in world languages are oral sounds. We have only a few nasal sounds. I think English, of course, has 3 and Malayalam may have 5 or 6 nasal sounds, not many. Got it? The larger chunk, of course, comprises oral sounds. That is, sounds produced through the mouth. So, then you also have something called nasalized sound. What is a nasalized sound? We don't have nasalized sounds in English or in Malayalam, but in Hindi you have this Hindi word ang for I, right? The final sound there is a nasalized sound. Or in French you have words like bon and so on, which is a nasalized sound. Now what is special about the nasalized sound? As I have explained in the notes, a nasalized sound is one that is articulated with air escaping through the mouth and the nose simultaneously. Such a sound is called nasalized. Take our English m, ma, m. The two lips come together and the oral passage is closed completely. So air escapes only through the nose. When you produce oral sounds, the nasal passage is completely closed, which means air does not escape through the nose. If there is a small leakage through the nose, you say that the person is speaking through his nose. Remember? Sometimes we say, why is he talking with a nasal twang? That is because, when you produce an oral sound, sometimes air could leak through the nose as well, and that is when your sound becomes nasal. But nasalized sounds, in certain world languages are produced with air escaping through the nose and the mouth. I hope you understood that. And then we come to the last part, the tongue. In fact, the tongue is the most important articulator. It's the most important of the organs of speech. It's the most mobile and flexible. It is capable of assuming different shapes and different positions within the mouth. It's the most active. You can't speak without the tongue because you know how, active the tongue gets when you start speaking. But in phonetics, we speak of 4 parts. We divide the tongue into 4 parts for convenience sake. That is the tip, the blade, the front and the back. What is the tip of the tongue? Well, the extremity, the extreme end of the tongue that you can put out is known as the tip of the tongue. I don't have to explain what the tip of the tongue is. It's there right in front. Okay. And then you have the blade and the front again. So even though I described the tip as the front of the tongue, no, you have another part which is labeled as the front. So we will see what that is. The blade, the front and the back. The blade is, your tongue is at rest now. I hope you're not talking or singing right now. Your tongue is at rest. The part of the tongue which touches your teeth ridge when your tongue is at rest is called the blade of the tongue. The part of the tongue which touches the hard palate when the tongue is at rest is known as the front of the tongue. And the back of the tongue is that part of your tongue which is opposite the soft palate. That is, when the tongue is at rest, the back of the tongue more or less touches the soft palate. You understand? It's easy. The front, the back and the blade of the tongue. Alright? So these are the main articulators. So in the notes, of course, I have given you an overview. I have even given it in the form of a family tree, how the sounds can be classified under the 3 systems, respiratory, phonatory and articulatory. And under phonatory you have respiratory you have diaphragm, then the muscles of the chest and also the lungs and trachea. Under phonatory system you have the larynx and the vocal folds, and under articulatory system pharynx, lips, teeth, roof of the mouth and tongue. And under the roof of the mouth you can further identify teeth ridge, hard palate, soft palate and uvula. What about the tongue? The tongue can further be classified into categorized into 5 parts as the tip, blade, front and back. I have also in this diagram, the diagram that I provided in the notes, mentioned root of the tongue. That is the place where the tongue is attached to the body. Okay, the root of the tongue.